Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
Imagine this unfolding in the quiet suburbs of Ohio, where the leaves turn early and the evenings carry a chill that seeps into your bones long before winter officially arrives. Because it's been exactly 2 weeks since I last heard a single word from my son Mark, who has always been the steady anchor in my life ever since his father passed away 5 years ago, leaving behind a void that only family could fill. And during those endless days of silence, with no calls, no texts, no replies to the voicemails I left pleading for even a quick update on his day at the garage or whether he'd finally fixed that leaky faucet in his kitchen, my worry built like a storm cloud over Lake Erie, darkening every routine moment from brewing my morning coffee in the empty house on Elm Street to showing properties to prospective buyers who chattered about school districts and commute times while my mind wandered to worst-case scenarios, imagining Mark injured on the job or tangled in some argument with a customer that escalated beyond words. Mark and I shared a bond forged in the everyday struggles of Midwestern life, where he grew up tinkering with car engines in our driveway, dreaming of owning his own repair shop someday, and confiding in me about everything from his first heartbreak in high school to the financial pinch of adulting when bills piled up faster than he could wrench them away. But lately he'd been distant, mentioning vague troubles at work with overtime that paid little and debts from a truck repair he couldn't afford outright. And I'd offered help repeatedly, drawing from my real estate commissions that were holding steady despite the market's ups and downs, yet he brushed it off every time, insisting he had it under control, which only amplified my unease, because I knew my boy well enough to sense when pride masked deeper problems, like the time his dad hid his own health scares until it was too late. As the first week dragged on without a peep, I started with small checks. Driving by his house on my way to open houses, noticing his pickup truck absent from the driveway more often than not, which could mean late shifts or weekend getaways, but combined with the radio silence, it gnawed at me during quiet afternoons when I'd scroll through old photos on my phone of us at county fairs laughing over cotton candy, or him helping me paint the garage after a storm. And by the second week, my attempts to reach out expanded to calling his coworkers at the auto shop where he fixed transmissions for folks driving beat-up sedans just like ours used to be, leaving messages that went unanswered, and even texting an old girlfriend he'd mentioned in passing, hoping she might know something, but her polite response of not hearing from him either only fueled the fire of my anxiety, making me question if he'd finally met someone serious who was pulling him into a new circle away from his overprotective mom. The neighborhood grapevine offered no solace either when I casually asked our mail carrier about any unusual mail piling up at Mark's place, only to learn it was business as usual, with utility bills and junk flyers accumulating untouched, which painted a picture of neglect that clashed with the responsible son I raised. And as dusk approached on that 14th evening, with the sky bruising into deep purples and the air crisp enough to crunch underfoot, I could no longer contain the mounting dread that something far more sinister than a busy schedule was at play, so I grabbed my keys, slipped into my worn jacket, the one with patches from years of property inspections, and headed out, telling myself this was just a welfare check, nothing more intrusive than leaving a pie on the porch like neighbors do in times of worry. The drive across town felt interminable, with rush-hour traffic crawling along the interstate, where commuters in their SUVs blasted radios, oblivious to my internal turmoil, and my thoughts raced through memories of Mark as a teenager, sneaking out for late-night drives only to call home sheepish and safe each time, reassuring me that boys will be boys. But now at 32 he deserved space, yet maternal instinct overrode reason, urging me forward, because what if he lay hurt inside, unable to reach for his phone, or worse, entangled in circumstances beyond his control, like the debts he'd hinted at that could involve shady lenders circling like vultures over a stalled economy. Pulling into his driveway under the glow of the automatic porch light that he'd installed himself, the house appeared deceptively normal, with its tidy lawn and curtains drawn against the fading light, his truck parked at an odd angle suggesting a hurried arrival, and as I ascended the steps, the spare key he entrusted to me years ago for emergencies turned smoothly in the lock, opening the door to that familiar scent of motor oil mingled with leftover takeout from the pizza joint down the road where we'd shared slices after his dad's funeral, discussing dreams over greasy crusts. Calling his name softly into the living room where tools lay scattered on the coffee table and a mug of cold coffee sat forgotten, I moved through the space, noting the subtle disarray of unwashed dishes in the sink and mail unopened on the countersigns of life. Interrupted rather than abandoned, which eased my fears momentarily until I ventured into the bedroom where the bed was unmade with blankets draped haphazardly, and that's when it hit me, a faint ragged breathing emanating from beneath the frame, like someone struggling to remain undetected in the shadows, sending a shiver racing down my spine, colder than any autumn draft, because in that suspended moment, before I knelt down and grasped the edge of the blanket, my entire body went rigid with a primal fear, realizing that whatever lurked there held the key to unraveling the mystery of my son's vanishing act. And as I pulled the fabric aside, slowly the dim light revealed a pair of wide, terrified eyes staring back at me, belonging to a stranger whose presence shattered the illusion of normalcy and plunged me into a nightmare where family secrets breathed in the dark, waiting to be exposed. Those wide, terrified eyes locked onto mine in the dim glow filtering through the bedroom blinds, turning what should have been a simple welfare check into a confrontation with an unknown intruder whose sudden appearance in my son's house amplified the dread that had been simmering for 2 weeks and made my pulse thunder in my ears as I fought the urge to scream or dial emergency services right then, because in that frozen instant her pale face, streaked with grime and framed by tangled hair, suggested not a burglar, but someone fleeing their own demons, much like the desperate clients I'd encountered over years of selling homes to folks down on their luck. She didn't lunge or scramble away, but instead whispered a frantic plea for me not to call the police, her voice hoarse and laced with exhaustion, as if she'd been holding her breath in that cramped space for far longer than anyone should endure. And I hesitated, my hand still gripping the blanket edge, because something in her desperate gaze reminded me of my own vulnerabilities after losing my husband, when every shadow felt like a threat to the fragile life I'd rebuilt through sheer grit and open houses that dragged on into evenings. Helping her slide out from under the bed where dust motes danced in the air like forgotten worries, I steadied her as she stood on shaky legs, her rumpled clothes carrying the faint musty scent of prolonged hiding, and she introduced herself as Sarah, a supposed friend of Mark's from the garage where he spent his days elbow-deep in engines fixing transmissions for harried commuters who couldn't afford delays, and she claimed she'd been staying there temporarily after her apartment flooded during last week's rains, a story that rang with partial truth given the damp spots on her sleeves, but her evasive glances toward the bedroom door and the way she clutched her threadbare backpack suggested layers of deception that I couldn't ignore, especially since Mark's prolonged silence had already eroded my trust in the normalcy of his world. We migrated to the kitchen where the overhead light cast harsh shadows on the cluttered counters piled with unopened mail and takeout containers from the local Chinese place that Mark favored for its cheap portions, and as I poured her a glass of water from the tap, ignoring the faint metallic taste that came from old pipes, I pressed gently for details about my son's whereabouts, because no mother could stomach 14 days of void without demanding answers, and she mumbled that Mark was out on a delivery run to Cleveland hauling auto parts for a big client, which sounded plausible for a mechanic chasing extra cash in a tightening economy, but her fidgeting fingers twisting the glass rim betrayed unease, hinting at troubles deeper than flooded basements, like the financial strains he'd confided in me months ago when he'd mentioned loans from informal lenders to cover unexpected shop expenses that ate into his paycheck before it even hit the bank. Sharing a slice of the leftover pie I'd brought from home in a misguided attempt to normalize the intrusion, I opened up about my own life as a real estate agent navigating slow sales in a market flooded with foreclosures and empty nesters like myself who clung to routines to fend off loneliness, which seemed to loosen her guard just enough for her to admit that Mark had been under considerable stress lately, talking in vague terms about debts piling up from bad bets at the local racetrack, a habit he'd picked up after a rough breakup that left him questioning his choices and seeking quick wins in the adrenaline of the stands where folks from all walks bet their grocery money on long shots. Her words struck a chord because I'd sensed his distraction during our last phone call when he cut conversations short, claiming fatigue from double shifts, yet now it painted a picture of recklessness that explained the ghosting, but not why he'd shut out his own mother, who would have listened without judgment or loaned from her savings scraped together from commission checks that barely covered the mortgage on Elm Street. Noticing a crumpled receipt peeking from under a stack of bills on the counter for multiple cash advances from an ATM downtown totaling amounts far beyond his usual spending, I pocketed it discreetly as a subtle clue to the underbelly of his troubles, feeling a pang of guilt for invading his privacy, yet justified by the maternal drive that overrode boundaries, much like the time I'd once rifled through his dad's desk drawers searching for clues to his late nights, only to find harmless poker stubs. Just as Sarah began to elaborate on the racetrack, Woe's headlights pierced the front windows signaling an unexpected visitor, and she paled, urging me to duck into the pantry, where shelves of canned goods concealed me like a poorly planned stakeout in one of those neighborhood watch seminars I'd attended out of boredom, and through the slatted door I watched as a stocky man in a worn leather jacket pounded on the door, bellowing for Mark about overdue payments, his voice rough as gravel from years of shouting over machinery, and he identified himself as Rick, a lender from the auto parts underworld who dealt in high-interest favors for workers like my son caught in cash crunches. Rick lingered for several tense minutes, kicking at the porch railing in frustration before stomping off into the night, muttering about repossessing the truck if things didn't straighten out, which sent a chill through me deeper than the evening air, because it confirmed the debts were no idle gossip, but a noose tightening around Mark's neck, with enforcers like this circling close enough to threaten family. Once the coast cleared, Sarah emerged from her hiding spot and spilled more details about how Mark had borrowed from Rick to cover gambling losses after a string of misfortunes at the track, where he'd gone hoping to flip a small stake into seed money for his dream shop, but the losses snowballed, turning a temporary fix into a cycle of desperation that kept him dodging calls, including mine, to avoid the shame of admitting failure to the woman who'd raised him to stand tall. My frustration boiled over at the image of this Rick preying on hardworking folks like a wolf in sheep's clothing, and when Sarah tried to minimize the danger, insisting Mark could handle it, I couldn't resist a touch of payback for her earlier cagginess, so I casually remarked how I'd recently closed a deal on a property next to the sheriff's deputy, who specialized in tracking down deadbeat lenders, dropping just enough fabricated detail from my real estate tales to make her eyes widen and her promises to relay messages to Mark flow more freely, a witty deflection that turned her stonewalling into reluctant cooperation, leaving me with a small satisfying edge amid the worry, like outsmarting a nosy client who pried too deep into your listings. But as she slipped out the back door into the gathering dusk, vowing to check on him soon, I remained behind, sifting through the bedroom dresser, where amid socks and spare change I discovered a delicate silver earring tangled in a phone charger cord, its engraving of an initial S catching the light, and while it could belong to Sarah, the style seemed too elegant for her rough around the edges vibe, suggesting another visitor, whose presence added a layer of intrigue to the mystery. Just as my own phone vibrated with an unknown number's text reading, "Stay out of it if you know what's good for you," the anonymous warning freezing me in place and propelling the uncertainty into a cliffhanger of who else lurked in the shadows of my son's hidden life. That anonymous text lingered like a bad aftertaste from cheap diner coffee as I slipped out of Mark's house into the enveloping night, where streetlights cast long shadows across lawns dotted with forgotten Halloween pumpkins, and drove home with my mind churning through the implications of Sarah's half-truths and Rick's aggressive visit, because if my son had tangled himself in debts severe enough to attract such warnings, then my initial intrusion under the bed had merely scratched the surface of a problem festering far deeper than the financial woes he'd brushed off during our last strained conversation months ago, when he'd claimed everything was fine despite the weariness in his voice that echoed his father's before the heart issues surfaced. By the time dawn broke over the rooftops of Elm Street, filtering pale light into my kitchen where I nursed a mug of black coffee strong enough to wake the dead, I resolved to return to his place before the neighborhood stirred fully, because waiting for Sarah's promised update felt too passive for a mother whose instincts screamed that time was slipping away like sand through fingers, and the crumpled receipt I'd pocketed hinted at cash flows drying up faster than the Ohio River in drought season, leaving Mark vulnerable to predators like Rick, who thrived on desperation in these hardscrabble suburbs, where auto workers and realtors like me scraped by on commissions and overtime. Arriving back at his driveway under a sky still heavy with morning mist, I let myself in again, the door's familiar creak, now a guilty accomplice to my escalating invasions of privacy, which I justified as necessary vigilance even though a nagging voice in my head whispered that I was becoming the overbearing figure Mark had joked about during family barbecues, the one who checked on him too often after college, sending care packages of homemade lasagna when he lived off ramen and regrets. The house in daylight revealed more neglect than the dusk had hidden, with sunlight slanting through windows to illuminate dust-covered shelves and stacks of bills teetering on the coffee table like a precarious Jenga tower ready to topple under the weight of ignored responsibilities, and I headed straight for his makeshift office in the corner, a cluttered desk piled with mechanic manuals and pay stubs that painted a grim picture of earnings eroded by rising costs, from gas prices to grocery runs at the local Walmart where I'd bumped into him last month loading up on bulk toilet paper, his cart heavier than his smile suggested. Rifling through the papers with a mix of reluctance and determination, I uncovered loan documents yellowed at the edges from hasty handling, bearing signatures not just from Mark, but a second party in elegant script that could belong to Sarah or perhaps another confidant, the terms outlining interest rates steep enough to bury a man alive, requiring payments that exceeded his monthly take-home after taxes and child support if he ever settled down, though he'd sworn off that route after seeing my own marriage's toll. These findings twisted my gut because they confirmed the gambling spiral Sarah had alluded to, but added a layer of complicity, suggesting Mark hadn't acted alone in this folly, borrowing not for the shop dream we discussed over backyard beers, but to chase highs at the track where the roar of engines drowned out rational thought, much like the distractions that had pulled his dad into late nights at the mill, leaving me to handle the home front with a stiff upper lip and a side of resentment that simmered unspoken. A noise from the attached garage jolted me from the documents, the side door ajar, allowing a sliver of light to spill across the concrete floor littered with wrenches and oil rags, and creeping closer, I peered inside to find Rick once more, his burly frame hunched over Mark's workbench, rifling through drawers with the entitlement of someone who considered the space his collateral, his muttered curses about missing ledgers revealing a hunt for proof of assets to seize in this brutal game of debtor versus lender that preyed on folks like my son, caught between pride and peril. Ducking behind a pile of stacked tires, their rubbery scent masking my shallow breaths, I weighed my options, confronting this intruder outright risked escalation in a neighborhood where such disputes often ended in police reports that stained reputations, or playing it safe by slipping away to gather allies from my real estate network of lawyers and deputies who owed me favors from past closings. But the fire of protectiveness went out as I watched him pocket what looked like a small notebook, scribbled with figures that could damn Mark further. He departed soon after, slamming the garage door with a force that rattled the tools on the walls, leaving me to emerge and snatch the fallen notebook, its pages filled with IOUs in Mark's handwriting, one entry particularly glaring, a payout to an initialed S for services rendered in keeping quiet, which blurred the lines between debt and something more insidious like blackmail, or a cover-up for side dealings that explained Sarah's underbed terror and the anonymous text fight. The growing unease pressed in as I photographed the evidence, my phone's flash a brief intruder in the dim space, realizing that Mark's choices to hide this from me stemmed from a fear of disappointing the mom who'd sacrificed weekends for his soccer games and college tuition, scraping by on 2 jobs after his dad's passing, yet my own decisions to pry unchecked now mirrored his secrecy, creating a cycle of distrust that made me question if intervention would save him or shatter what remained of our bond. When my phone buzzed with Sarah's incoming call, I answered warily, her voice hushed over the line, warning that Rick was intensifying his search and closing in on loose ends. But sensing an opportunity for leverage, I steered the conversation with feigned naivety about the notebook while subtly recording her responses, then dropped a calculated bombshell claiming I'd forwarded copies to a contact in the district attorney's office who audited predatory lending practices, a tall tale woven from half-remembered stories of clients, but potent enough to make her falter and spill that Mark had last been seen heading toward a meetup with Rick's superior to negotiate terms, her panic yielding details under the pressure of my improvised trap, a clever exposure of her lies that provided a satisfying Twist of revenge, like cornering a slippery buyer at the negotiation table with overlooked fine print, leaving her stammering promises of more intel, while I hung up with a modicum of control reclaimed from the chaos. Yet, as I stepped back into the house toward the hallway, the floorboard groaned under my weight, and from the shadows near the landline phone, I caught the tail end of a muffled conversation on speaker, its voice low and menacing, dictating terms to an unseen listener about silencing inquiries before they unraveled the whole operation, the call cutting off abruptly as heavy footsteps approached from outside, freezing me in terror with the realization that the walls themselves held ears, and the threats were drawing perilously close to home. Those heavy footsteps approaching from outside turned out to be nothing more sinister than the neighbor's overzealous Labrador bounding across the lawn in pursuit of a squirrel, oblivious to the tension coiling through me like a spring wound too tight after overhearing that ominous phone conversation dictating terms about silencing nosy interlopers, which only heightened my resolve to chase down Sarah for the full story, because if Mark's debts had entangled him with a network of enforcers, then my piecemeal discoveries from loan papers and hidden notebooks were mere fragments of a puzzle demanding assembly before the pieces scattered irretrievably into the shadows of whatever operation lurked beneath his everyday mechanic's life. The morning after that heart-pounding false alarm, I texted Sarah with coordinates for a meetup at the roadside diner off Route 23, a weathered establishment where the vinyl booths sagged under years of truckers' waits and the coffee came bottomless, but bitter enough to match my mood as I nursed a cup waiting for her arrival amid the clatter of plates and the murmur of locals trading tales of factory layoffs and rising utility bills that mirrored the economic squeezes pushing folks like my son toward risky shortcuts in pursuit of stability. She slid into the booth across from me, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting Rick's bulk to block the entrance at any moment, and after a few awkward sips of her soda, which fizzed nervously in the glass, she launched into a more candid explanation claiming not just friendship with Mark, but a partnership in a side gig salvaging and flipping auto parts from junkyards to eBay buyers hungry for cheap fixes in this era of skyrocketing repair costs, a venture that started innocently enough with weekend hauls of rusty fenders and carburetors, but spiraled when Rick's crew discovered their operation and demanded protection money disguised as investment shares, leaving them hemorrhaging cash faster than a punctured oil line. The twist in her narrative came when she pulled out her phone to show me the loan agreement I'd photographed the day before, her elegant signature scrawled beside Mark's, confirming that the second party wasn't some shadowy outsider, but her own hand forging the document to inflate the borrow amount under the naive assumption they could repay through quick flips of high-value transmissions, though the reality of Rick's escalating vig had turned their ambition into a trap snapping shut around necks already strained by daily grinds like Mark's 12-hour shifts and my own marathon of property tours chasing commissions that evaporated with every failed closing. Sarah's admission painted my son in a new light, not merely as a gambler chasing thrills at the track, but as a collaborator in this under-the-table hustle driven by dreams of independence from the garage's dead-end wages, where bosses skimmed hours and customers haggled over every bolt, a betrayal of sorts since he'd confided in me about wanting his own shop, yet omitted this risky path, choosing silence over my counsel much as I'd chosen intrusion over patience, a parallel that made me reflect on how our family history of unspoken burdens from his dad's overtime addictions had seeded these patterns of evasion, leaving me to wonder if my hovering had pushed him further into isolation, or if the economy's relentless grind bore the true blame for his descent. As she delved deeper, describing how Rick had once keyed Mark's truck in a parking lot as a subtle warning, the image of scratches marring the paint he'd so proudly buffed ignited a spark of that protective fury I'd felt during open houses when shady investors tried to lowball desperate sellers, and spotting Rick's familiar vehicle pulling into the diner's lot across the divided highway, I seized the moment for a calculated counterstrike, firing off an anonymous text to the local non-emergency line about a suspicious plate linked to reported thefts of auto parts, a tip drawn from Sarah's own details, but anonymous enough to evade blowback, watching with grim satisfaction as patrol cars converged on his truck for what would likely be a drawn-out inspection, his face contorting in confusion, and then rage as officers waved him over the petty sabotage, delivering a humorous jolt of payback, like slipping a whoopee cushion under a pompous client's chair at signing, turning the tables without direct confrontation, and eliciting a stifled chuckle from Sarah, who realized the irony of her tormentor now ensnared in red tape. The brief triumph faded as she revealed the fuller extent of Mark's vanishing act, explaining that he'd bolted with their remaining cash stash to confront Rick's higher-up in a bid to renegotiate or expose the racket up near Toledo, leaving her to dodge the fallout. A loan which contextualized her underbed refuge after Rick's associates had trashed her apartment in search of leverage, a dilemma that forced me to confront whether to pursue him solo, risking the same perils, or involve law enforcement who might unravel the operation, but at the cost of criminal charges for their forgeries and side dealings that could land Mark in cuffs rather than safety. We wrapped up with her handing over a battered burner phone Mark had stashed for emergencies, its screen spiderwebbed from a drop, but battery still holding, as she urged me to use it for encrypted updates, and as I drove away fiddling with the device in the cup holder, hoping for a clue amid the dashboard clutter, a single unread voicemail icon blinked to life, playing Mark's voice, strained and distant from what sounded like a windy highway, pleading, "Mom, if you're getting this, don't follow the trail. It's messier than you know," with a sudden crash interrupting mid-sentence, like shattering glass or a scuffle that cut the line short, sending ice through my veins, because the plea hinted at immediate danger, while the messier part alluded to complicities I hadn't yet grasped. The earring's initial S, which I dismissed as Sarah's, suddenly loomed larger upon reflection, since her full name was Sarah Klein, but the engraving evoked a familial echo, perhaps a sister or alias, in this tangled web, and just as that suspicion crystallized, the burner vibrated with an incoming message from a blocked sender, a grainy photo materializing of Mark slumped in a dim room, his wrists bound behind him, face marred by fresh bruises, the accompanying text stark and chilling, "Your meddling ends." This now propelling me into a vortex of terror where the whispers of betrayal coalesced into a clarion call for action, yet laced with the ambiguity of who truly held the strings in this escalating nightmare. That grainy photo of Mark bound and bruised on the burner phone fueled a desperate urgency that propelled me northward through the fading afternoon light along the interstate, where semis thundered past like indifferent behemoths, oblivious to the personal apocalypse unfolding in my battered sedan as I gripped the wheel with knuckles whitening from the strain of suppressing panic, because Sarah's vague directions to this run-down warehouse district outside Toledo evoked visions of abandoned factories rusting under overcast skies, the kind of forsaken industrial relics that dotted the Rust Belt, reminding me of the mill closures that had claimed my husband's overtime dreams and left our family teetering on the edge of financial quicksand long before his heart gave out under the weight of unspoken stresses. Every mile marker ticked by, with my mind replaying the voicemail's interrupted plea and the crash that followed, interpreting it as evidence of violence inflicted by Rick's network, or perhaps deeper complicities involving Sarah's evasive partnership and the initialed earring that nagged at me like an unsolved listing detail in a property disclosure, where omissions hid costly surprises waiting to bankrupt the unwary buyer, in this case my own flesh and blood, whose choices to shield me from the mess now mirrored my own impulsive meddling that had escalated from underbed discoveries to anonymous tips and diner stakeouts, all in a futile bid to reclaim control over a narrative slipping from maternal grasp. Parking in the encroaching shadows near the hulking structure, its corrugated walls scarred by graffiti and broken windows gaping like wounds, I slipped through a rusted side door, the air inside thick with the acrid tang of stagnant oil and decay, mingled with the faint metallic hint of fierce sweat that clung to hidden corners, much like the undercurrents of desperation I'd sensed in clients selling homes to escape mounting debts in neighborhoods where foreclosure signs sprouted like weeds after a summer rain. Navigating the labyrinth of towering crates and dormant machinery that loomed like silent sentinels in the dim emergency lighting, I whispered Mark's name into the void, my footsteps muffled on the concrete floor, slick with unseen puddles, while my phone's flashlight beam cut erratic paths, revealing discarded scraps that pieced together the puzzle, a torn snapshot of Mark and Sarah grinning at the county fair amid cotton candy stands and Ferris wheel lights, suggesting a camaraderie born of shared hustles. Another faded photo of a woman strikingly similar to Sarah, but hardened by years, her features etched with the weariness of addiction, and beside it a tarnished locket engraved with that elusive S initial, which crystallized the twist as I realized this wasn't mere coincidence, but a familial thread weaving through the betrayal, perhaps a sister entangled in the same web of forgeries and side gigs that had ensnared my son. The growing conflict crested us. Voices drifted from a partially ajar office door ahead, low and heated, with Rick's gravelly timbre dominating the exchange, demanding the whereabouts of the pilfered cash, while a woman's sharp retort cut through, accusing Mark of dragging innocence into his folly. The words laced with resentment that echoed the dilemmas I'd faced in my own life, balancing support for wayward loved ones against the drain on personal reserves like the savings I'd depleted after his dad's funeral to keep the lights on and the fridge stocked for a grieving boy who now faced repercussions from choices that made me question if my overprotectiveness had inadvertently fostered his secrecy, or if the relentless economic grind of auto parts scams and track bets was the true architect of this downfall. Creeping closer with my back pressed against cold metal shelving, I peered through the crack to behold the scene that shattered remaining illusions. Mark slumped in a rickety chair, wrists secured by zip ties, his face swollen and shadowed by fresh contusions, yet his eyes held a defiant spark as Rick paced like a caged bull. But the true revelation landed like a gut punch when the woman stepped into view, not Sarah, but her identical twin Lisa, the engraved initial now explained as a shared heirloom from their fractured upbringing, the argument unfolding to expose her as the mastermind who'd initiated the deeper loans, forging documents to fuel her own gambling addictions, pulling Mark and Sarah into the vortex under promises of easy flips that devolved into a cycle of threats and hideouts, explaining the underbed breathing as Sarah's desperate evasion from Lisa's escalating demands, and the anonymous texts as Lisa's attempts to ward off interlopers like me who threatened to unravel her control. The dilemma ripped through me, whether to burst in, risking a chaotic melee that could endanger Mark further, or bide time for an opening that might allow a smarter play, drawing from the real estate savvy I'd honed in high-stakes negotiations where patience often trumped bluster. But as Rick turned toward the door, boasting about liquidating Mark's assets to cover shortfalls, including the house I'd helped him buy with a modest down payment, my restraint snapped, and I snatched a loose pipe from the floor, clanging it against a nearby beam with deliberate noise that echoed through the warehouse like a starter pistol, drawing the trio's attention, while I thumbed 911 on the burner phone, relaying coordinates in hushed urgency, the distraction buying precious seconds as sirens wailed faintly in the distance, a witty improvisation of revenge that turned the space into an unwitting alarm system, much like rigging a faulty lock to deter squatters from a vacant property. Watching Rick's confusion morph into alarm and Lisa's composure fracture as she fumbled to loosen Mark's bonds, her gaze locking onto mine through the door with a flicker of recognition that blended fear and weary resignation. Chaos erupted moments later as uniformed officers flooded the space, cuffing Rick mid-protest and separating the twins amid a flurry of accusations, with Mark freed and staggering into my embrace, his apologies spilling forth in a torrent about the initial forgeries, the track losses that snowballed under Lisa's influence, and his deliberate silence to spare me the fallout from a mess rooted in the same pride that had silenced his dad during health declines. Yet even as paramedics tended his wounds in the ambulance en route to the hospital, with his hand clasped in mine, murmuring plans for a clean slate, perhaps selling the house to clear debts and rebuilding the shop dream without shortcuts, his evasive glance when I probed for the unvarnished truth about Sarah's full role or any lingering ties to Lisa's network left an ambiguity that chilled deeper than the Ford drip, cooling his veins, making me ponder if family secrets ever truly dissolve or merely metamorphose, burrowing into new shadows beneath fresh beds, waiting for the next unwitting pull of a blanket to expose them in a cycle of forgiveness teetering against irreparable loss, where the line between protector and enabler blurs eternally in the quiet aftermath of Dusk's revelations.